T.S. Eliot is a towering figure of American literature, British literature, and world culture generally. He is an extraordinary figure, enormously important to understanding the modernist movement broadly and the 20th century even more completely. You cannot come to a full understanding of either of those periods or those cultural phenomena without grappling with the figure of Thomas Stearns Eliot. Significantly, he was born in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri, to a wealthy and notable New England family. His grandfather was a Boston Brahmin, so to speak, who traveled west and helped found, largely did found, Washington University in St. Louis, a great institution. And he grew up with this very self-conscious awareness of his aristocracy. He was educated at an academy attenuated to Washington University, so he was very much aware of this even more. He would go home and things would be very proper. In New Englandy, they were very self-conscious of their roots. And then he would go to school and it would be, oh yeah, my grandpa built this. So you can see those sorts of issues going on. His childhood itself was fairly unexceptional. Other than that, he was a little bit of a sickly child, so he spent a lot of time reading, not so much into the rough and tumble sports. But the reading itself is interesting. He was quite the fan of Mark Twain, fellow Missourian, and grew up as a fan of Tom Sawyer and the Adventures and Huck Finn and all of that deeply American voice of the commoner literature, which is a little bit curious when you consider what he ends up as. Now, after high school, he goes to prep school in Massachusetts, Milton Academy, for a year before matriculating at Harvard. It's a BA from Harvard. He gets an MA at Harvard. Then he spent a year studying philosophy at the Sorbonne in Paris. And then he went on to PhD studies at Harvard, particularly in Sanskrit and Indian religion. He made plans to study at Marburg in Germany. Then those get scuttled by the outbreak of World War I, and he asked to settle for Oxford, where he settles into the life of England. And in these years, he starts to really grow into himself, or at least the construction of himself, where he deliberately assembles this identity. While at Oxford, he writes his first important poem, Prufrock. He meets Ezra Pound a couple of years later in 1914, who begins promoting Eliot's work to publishers, most notably Harriet Monroe at the magazine Poetry, great figure in modernist verse. And also, Ezra takes on the same role as he did for Yeats in midwifing this raw talent into something more more in a Poundian mold, consulting and editing, sometimes very vigorously editing Eliot's work. Eliot himself astounded Pound for the material that he was presenting him. Pound remarked the fact that Eliot seems to have modernized himself, and that says an awful lot. That is very high praise coming from Pound, who has been pulling teeth with Yeats for so many years at this point. And Eliot's star begins to rise. He decides very early on, okay, I'm going to start publishing poetry. I'm going to get married. I'm going to settle into this identity as a poet. He essentially says goodbye to his academic career. He writes a dissertation more out of a consolation to his parents, who are largely funding his life in England. But he writes a dissertation, but then when it's time for him to sail back to Harvard to actually defend it, well, again, World War I intervenes. the shipping the shipping lanes become dangerous, so he says, okay, I'm not going back. And he conveniently lets that sort of fly away, and he gives up on that. But he has by now settled into an understanding of himself as a poet. He supports himself from that point on with a series of actual jobs. He does a year of teaching high school, I believe, and then he gets a job in a bank for about, I think, 8 years. And then ultimately he becomes a publisher for really the bulk of his adult life. He works in publishing a number of very significant poets until his death in 1965. The actual career, however, as a poet is going on throughout this time. He publishes in this time some of his greatest poetry, some era-defining literary criticism, and ultimately even some very notable plays. He liked the theater. He always had this troubled relationship with popular entertainment, popular culture, but he was a big fan of murder mysteries, and his first notable play is about the murder of Thomas Becket in England. Always a little bit high and low, clashing with Eliot, and that is something to bear in mind as he goes forward. He becomes a British citizen in 1927, joins the Church of England the same year, and this essentially solidifies his new identity and marks a clear break with that sickly kid from St. Louis who so loved Tom Sawyer. He was now a high priest of European culture. He's disdaining largely popular culture. The popular literature largely handed down to the 20th century from the Victorians, the Romantics, and even occasionally Shakespeare. He's got a little bit of an iffy, lukewarm feeling for Shakespeare. Instead, he celebrates people like Donne, people like Dante, people like Hopkins, these avatars of much more obscure poetry, much more difficult cultural literature and the cultural media of rigor and obscurity and sometimes obscurantism outright. He is asserting a very vigorous understanding of what culture is and should be. He asserts also a whole new strategy of reading that is remarkably depersonalized. Let's not focus so much on biography. Let's not focus so much on individuals. It is all about the culture that produces it. And this gives birth to a group of critics called the New Critics, the New Criticism, which dominates Anglo and American academia and popular culture or at least high culture for the remainder of the 20th century. He wins a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948, and his collection of poems about cats serves as the basis for the blockbuster Broadway hit of that title that comes out in 1981. By the time of his death in 1965, Eliot was the archetype of establishment culture. He himself coined this characterization in 1928 as, quote, a classicist in literature, a royalist in politics, an Anglo-Catholic in religion. He's a little stuffy. Even so, for many years, he endured marital difficulties and Vivian's death in an insane asylum. His next wife was 34 years his junior, I believe. He wrote much of The Wasteland in a psychiatric ward himself in Switzerland. Biographers have noted suggestions of sexual dysfunction throughout his adult life. Others have alleged homosexuality, either latent or consciously repressed. Many scholars have noted the racism, the misogyny, and the virulent anti-Semitism that pervades his work, both implicitly and explicitly. And while he maintained this very stuffy image of high culture, across two continents primarily and the world broadly. Historians can also point to a sustained friendship of sorts with the comedian Groucho Marx, who had the distinction of being Jewish, American, and very, very popular. T.S. Eliot is more than a caricature. He's also a sphinx. Much like his poetry in his complexities and contradictions, Eliot demands effort to understand.